Excellent.
Okay, so S83, an act relating to the creation of a project-based tax incremental financing program. Doug Hoffer, State Auditor from the State Auditor's Office. What a coincidence. Welcome.
Clever that way. Yes, thank you. For the record, Doug Hoffer, State Auditor. We did send a memo over. I know you guys are busy, so you might not have had a chance to see it, but the high level takeaways for me are, one, if you guys are interested in this, I encourage you, if you haven't already, to ask JFO to do their best to estimate what the cost to the Ed Fund might be in the near and long term. There's no way to know with certainty, but they have a pretty good track record of predicting. Second, this is very different than normal TIF, which is typically a district of some size, 6 square blocks, an entire downtown, something very substantial where the infrastructure investment is intended to generate all kinds of different economic activity that will lead to, increment to pay the debt and beyond. But if a smallish town is looking at one property or one block or one developer, one large business, it might sound good on paper and may be successful. On the other hand, as we know, as I pointed out in the memo, VEPC considers and approves applications from very substantial businesses all over the state and has for many years. And for any number of reasons, almost half of them don't make it. At least they don't make it sufficient to get the award, which means they don't do the capital investments or they don't do the new payroll and so forth. It's under the general heading of the best laid plans. And some of those businesses who were approved but didn't make it through are very substantial with a long history in Vermont, and they're big and successful otherwise, but sometimes the timing's wrong. There are reasons. So that presents, I think, some important, or it is risk that needs to be considered important for you guys, for the municipalities. They need to be very careful about the decisions they make in this regard if the program would allow them to get a mini TIF, project-based TIF. Now, even if they go into it and things look good for a while and they invest in and borrow for the infrastructure, even if a development doesn't succeed, one would imagine that that infrastructure would help them attract another developer, another business, someone else to fill the gap and eventually generate sufficient increment to pay the debt. That's not going to happen overnight. That's going to take a couple of years or more, during which the town is going to be on the hook, and not for a sliver of the increment that they can't afford, but the whole thing, including interest and capital and corpus. So these are just things worth considering. You guys, Tanya will talk briefly about some of the other main points in the memo, but you tell us if you want more or less information. Tanya, my chief auditor, Tanya Morehouse. I think most of you do, if not all of you.
Welcome.
Thank you. For the record, Tanya Morehouse, Chief Auditor at the State Auditor's Office. I thought I would just highlight a couple of the items in the memo that Auditor Hoffer sent last week. And if you have any questions as I go through, please stop me and let me know. We reviewed S83, and I think it might be the third or possibly fourth iteration of the concept of a project-based TIF. And the way that it's drafted now, it seems to have the least protections to the education fund and may actually have a higher risk to the municipalities themselves, as Auditor Hoffer mentioned. In terms of having the least protections for the Ed Fund, at this point, the way the bill is drafted, there's no limits on the number of project-based TIFs that VEPC could authorize, or there's no limit on the dollar amount that they could approve. So the impact on the education fund isn't clear, and at this point, it looks like it could not be forecasted. So if the bill were to proceed, We would just recommend that the committee consider specifying a maximum number of project-based TIFs and a maximum amount of education tax increment that the municipalities could retain. In addition, there isn't a limit right now on the length of time that tax increment may be retained by municipalities that may be approved by BEPC for a project-based TIF. The bill as drafted ties it to the length of time that a municipality decides to repay its debt. So if a municipality were to enter into a debt arrangement that's 30 years, they could keep tax increment for 30 years, at least as the way the bill is drafted right now. It also allows for 80% of the education tax increment to be retained. That's a higher percent than the TIF district program currently allows, which is 70%. So because of the potential for a longer period to retain increment and the higher percent that they would be allowed to keep, there would be a greater impact on the education fund. And to address those two issues, you could consider specifying a length of time that tax increment could be retained and lower the percent that could be retained as well. In terms of the potential greater risk to municipalities, Auditor Hoffer described that a bit. It really is a function of the way that the program is designed to be more modest than the TIF district program. But because of that, there's less diversity in terms of the public infrastructure projects that would be occurring, and also seemingly less diversity in the real property development that might occur. So you could have a situation where a municipality enters into a debt arrangement for a single public infrastructure improvement, expecting only, say, housing to occur. But were there to be a downturn in the housing market, the municipality would likely suffer and not generate the expected growth from the housing. And as Auditor Hoffer mentioned, there may not be another type of real property development kind of waiting in the wings that could make up for any decrease in the expected housing development. So the things that we thought could possibly address some of that risk is to require in the bill a kind of co-funding model approach, which basically requires that there's multiple levels of funding going into the public infrastructure improvement. So not just using tax increment to repay the debt, and limit the total percentage of the project costs that could be paid for with tax increment. You may also want to consider restricting the type of public infrastructure improvement to the ones that are most tangible and have the potential greatest nexus to stimulating private real property development. And then the last thing that we thought the committee could consider would be possibly requiring the municipalities to enter into a commitment with a developer for a certain dollar amount of real property development. So are there any questions about any of those?
Thank you, Tanya. I read your note before the meeting today, and I got to say I agree with just about all of it. We need to put more guardrails, putting the barriers, the parameters, and the length of time, and definitely on the 70%. What I need to educate myself on, and please speak to this as much as you're comfortable with, and then otherwise direct me elsewhere. How much of the not traditional, but the existing TIFs had a lot of these things, the total amounts, the number of years, the 70%, some of the developer agreements. How many of those things were written in statute, and how many of those were left to BEPC to work out? I'm trying to do a precedent comparison here. So as we look at this project TIF, how much can we definitely say we should emulate at least what we did with the larger TIFs currently in existence?
Well, I think there's kind of a dividing line between the pre-2006 TIFs and the post-2006 TIFs. So pre-2006, VEPSI didn't have a say in either the length of time that tax increment was kept or the percentage that was kept until the municipalities with those TIF districts filed, I forget what the name of the report was, but it basically was the status of what the TIF district consisted of as of a certain point in time. And then at that point, VEPSI started monitoring the activity of those TIF districts. So that's Winooski and the Burlington waterfront and the Milton North-South TIF. The post-2006 TIFs, most of the things that you mentioned are in statute and rule. So the length of time that tax increment may be retained is laid out in statute. It's 20 years. And it's 20 years from the date of the first debt. The percent that they may keep of the ed tax increment, that is also laid out in statute. In terms of the developer agreements, that is not in statute. But we've seen them in some of the TIF districts. It's something municipalities have done to protect themselves. And I think it's worked. It's worked in some TIF districts and hasn't worked so well in other ones. But for a program that's more narrow and doesn't have as much diversity as the bigger TIF district program, it seems like it would be a good control to require, because it would mean that a municipality was closer to actually realizing some real property development. And especially if you're just going to have a single public infrastructure project and maybe, one large real property development or maybe two small ones, and not have the diversity that the bigger TIF districts have, it just seems like there's an increased risk to the municipality of not being able to generate enough tax increment to repay their debt. So that's just one way to address that risk.
And by the way, what I said earlier is partly true. A municipality may find itself squeezed by the failure of or lack of development to the extent hoped for. And one option, of course, the old-fashioned way, is for them to make up the difference with general fund money from their own taxpayers. But of course, no mayor or town manager wants to do that if he or she doesn't have to. So you can assume going forward that in that event, they would come to you.
And our resource that we have available is the ed fund.
Well, they might come to you for general fund money if they can't meet their debt service.
So what I'll say is that, if I may, I definitely support us continuing this conversation on project-based TIFs, but I would want to do so addressing all of the concerns you outlined and adding a lot more of these guardrails into statute. So I don't know if that means we're going to make crossover, because that's a week and a half from now. But I would just put that statement on the table that I support project-based TIFs, but only with a lot of the concerns that you've outlined being addressed in statute and bill.
We just make friends everywhere we go.
Just a question regarding selection of developer in advance. Have you thought about what the next steps would be in the event that the developer that is selected and approved for the TIFs ceases to be effective, or that the municipality wants to fire him and get another? Have you thought about what the next steps would be there?
I think it would depend on the timing. If the town had not yet gone to the market and borrowed the money, then there's less of a problem. And we've seen some towns, Hartford's a good example, where they have phased their borrowing, which I thought was prudent. if you don't go all in, then you're not going to be hit with the giant debt service a year and a half down the road. But I'm sorry, Tanya, go ahead if you have more.
Yeah, I don't know that the particular private party that enters into the a developer agreement with the municipality would necessarily need to be like approved by VEPC, but we were thinking more that it would just be that the municipality has a development agreement in place with a private real estate developer to show that there is the real potential for private property development to occur. So not so much that DEPSI would be approving a particular private developer to be part of the to be part and parcel with the program, but more that they show or demonstrate that they are able to get a developer agreement so that it shows there's lower risk that they won't generate tax increment to repay their debt.
Frank, it becomes sometimes a chicken or an egg issue that it's hard to get a developer unless you know they've got the money. It's hard to get the money unless you know you've got a developer. But I'm sure it could be worked out.
Are banks wary of when you don't know when you have a chicken or an egg?
Certainly. But knowing that you've got a project that you are able to go ahead and do, you're going to have a developer much more willing to spend the time and money necessary to get a bid ready to be able to submit. And it's just it's a timing question. I understand what the auditor is saying, and it makes sense.
I get hung up on the word partner because by the nature of a partnership, one can act as and the other is obliged, as opposed to being held to a standard.
Responsible bidder.
Yeah.
I've never been an irresponsible bid in my life, but that doesn't make me a responsible bidder.
I mean, there could also be, I'm just thinking out loud here, a VEPC approval, contingent upon a development agreement. Right. So similar, I'm just thinking similar to the Burlington waterfront where they were not allowed to issue debt for the public infrastructure improvements around City Place until they had contracts, until the private developer had construction contracts in place for a certain dollar. So you could consider doing something like that, making it a contingent approval by VEPC.
That makes sense. Well, does anyone have any notion as to how what we're looking at here got to 80% versus 70%, how it got to 30 years as opposed to 20 years? Was there some logic behind the construction of this bill?
I think Senator Hinsdale introduced it, right? I don't know the answer to your question.
Okay, we'll ask her.
Ask for the moon and see what you get.
Hinsdale and Clarkson.
Senator, I expect that would be a question for VEPC, the Agency of Commerce, or the Vermont League of Cities and Towns.
Or the drafter's bill.
I have no idea.
Okay.
Yes.
So you said this is the fourth go at this, so to speak. I'd be curious on the previous iterations and the previous bienniums, if there was one bill that you thought we should maybe go to align with this. Was there a better version of this that you direct our attention to start from for this follow-up conversation about possibly amending this bill?
I could look back through the various iterations and see. I know that we provided significant comments, technical comments on every single one. So I wouldn't say that there was one that was flawless, but there's likely to be some that have more protections in them than this particular one. So I could definitely go back through and provide that information to the committee.
You know, for what it's worth, whatever it was, 4 or 5 years ago when this began, the agency and VEPSI were promoting this as truly small, mini TIFs, not just project-based, although all those words were used. And initially, they suggested that the amount of borrowing or project expenditures be limited to whatever, it was $2 or $3 million, something very modest. And in short order, that was jettisoned because people thought, that's not enough money, you can't really do much with that, and that may be true. However, to find ourselves now with a proposal that has no cap, not only suggests a potential problem for the Ed Fund and for a much longer period of time, but huge amounts of interest. I mean, the last time Tanya, at my request, estimated the interest payments of all the extant TIFs, it was over $100 million. Now, that's not uncommon, regardless of how you finance. If you're a municipality, you're going to go to the bond market, you're going to pay some interest. But as I have suggested to some of you and your colleagues in other rooms over the years, nobody would argue with the importance of this effort, which is to help towns that feel there's a need to, work on their infrastructure downtown, to either save or enhance the prospects and the sustainability of their downtown. That's a great idea. Everybody supports that. The only issue is whether this is the most effective and cost-effective way to do that. I think, with all the federal money that's sloshing around, it wouldn't be hard to seed a revolving loan fund, and it's possible, I think it's possible, that the interest could be reduced and everybody could save money. But then I've said that before, so.
So you're proposing a revolving loan fund that smaller community projects could draw from, rather than this rather complex TIF system that might make good sense where how we've been using it for larger municipalities with larger areas focusing development.
Yes.
I'm intrigued to hear more.
Well, this is the second issue this afternoon where we're wrestling with, say, borrowing that has, don't want to use the words out of control, but hasn't been paid back in at the time frame in which it was envisioned, student loans. And when things don't go in the time frames in which they were envisioned, it can get pretty damn big, pretty damn quick. Which, see, our neighbors in the last generation owe more money in student loans than the rest of us put together. It's the biggest thing out there. And it got into, those people got into it with our blessings. And lo and behold, they're the ones holding the bag right now.
Right.
Well, I would be interested in what the potential alternatives would be to that small town, the one that comes up every year. We talk about Bolton, Westford. And the purpose of the loan, about $5 billion to create a water and sewer system in the village area. And the question would be, what other source of funds might they have to be able to do that if they don't really have anything to put down as a down payment? And indeed, coming up with the money necessary to do matching funds, they don't have the money to do that either. So if there's another source of funds that would accomplish that same end other than TIF, happy to look at it, but I don't know that I know what it is.
Since revenue sharing dried up, and
I mean, there may be something, but I don't know what it is.
So with the revolving loan fund, I would assume that the interest, they would be managed by the bank. And so if Westford were to pay the installments, they'd be paying the interest back to not the bank, but the state. The state would be receiving those revenues. And that's not giving them the subsidy from the Ed Fund that is sort of the concern. But and then we get back to a TIF to try to track how much the grant list was at the start of it. And Is there a way to do TIF using the state rather than the municipal bond bank to keep the money within the realm or management of the state?
Well, I'm certainly no banker, but we do have effectively a bank already, and that's Vita. Now, Vita is not cheap, but it's not a bank. They don't have to make a profit. They need a loan loss reserve, of course, and all the usual elements of a lender. But no one has ever roughed out this proposal. I would argue that JFO should do that, but they don't do stuff on spec. You know, they're busy people and there aren't enough of them, but they could do it at your request. They certainly probably wouldn't, I should say certainly, but I don't expect they would get it done in the next 6 weeks. It might be something you might ask of them for next year.
Vita was established to do what banks wouldn't do.
Right.
If banks would have done it, Vita never would have been established. So it's
Well, this proposal is, as you know, keeps popping up like a jack in the box every year. And in previous iterations, we've talked about doing this on a test basis, a trial basis. That we took a certain number of TIFs. As I recall, project-based TIFs, we talked about doing somewhere between 3 and 7, and I think we wound up last year, if I remember correctly, on 5 as a sample, and then use that as a test case to determine if this concept is workable over time. And that's consistent with putting a cap on the amount that you do. Perhaps the initial cap might be on the lower side until there's a proof of concept here, and also caps on the amount of money that you lend, because these were envisioned always as mini TIFs. The number $5 billion comes to mind of what I recall from previous discussions here. And certainly in the Westford case, I think it was $5 billion, if I'm not mistaken.
I love that idea. If we could just allow this as like a pilot for Westford to show us that this could work.
Well, I would do a pilot larger than Westford. I would do a pilot of several, so that you, and recognize you're not going to get the results of did this work entirely as intended tomorrow. But a cap of a reasonably small number, manageable number, and also a manageable upper amount, and something that you can monitor as you go as to where we are.
so we have TIFs that are struggling now and not.
Well, this is a different form of TIF, though, than what we've done. And the concept, though, of where the revenue is coming to pay back the expense to get the project going, that's the only piece of this that is reasonably consistent.
Well, okay, I will.
For what it's worth,
The chair has some strong opinions on this. I have strong opinions on pilots that are, once they're started to be pilots, and lo and behold, no one goes back to find out what's been learned. So,
Well, that you certainly include, and that's, again, we've certainly done legislation in which we put, in fact, I know there's legislation we've done doing this year in the other committee that I'm on, that includes just that, not just a report back from the people who are the ones receiving the money of how things are going, but an independent review that tells us if we did something that makes sense and if it's working.
if I may, just a thought, while you all, obviously in committee and on the Senate side, discuss and eventually decide whether to go forward, and if so, how, there is historic and I think existing and continuing opposition to this in the other chamber. And I don't know how that's going to turn out, that'll develop as it does, but knowing that, instead of hitting loggerheads at some point in April or May and not getting it done and having the agency come back again and starting over, it wouldn't hurt to have a parallel conversation about how else could we do this. Mm-hmm. You certainly don't have the time or yet have the information to answer the question, but you could begin to ask the people who work for you to do some digging and report back to you with an alternative, which you've never had, frankly. And we keep beating this mini TIF thing and it doesn't get done. And even if, as Senator Brock suggested, you find support for a very modest pilot, effectively, that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile to investigate an alternative. So I just want to throw that out. I talked about this a lot. It doesn't get anywhere, but nothing gets anywhere.
I agree with Chair McDonald's point that looking at Hartford and what they've been struggling with and how the responses came back and what Burlington's seeing, those are larger communities that are struggling with TIFs. So I think these concerns about smaller based communities, project-based TIFs are very valid, and this might not be the best tool to move forward. So I like what you just said, Auditor Hoffer, is to look before and find alternatives to this to also consider as a parallel conversation. I'm just very agreeable today.
Do we agree that we have asked Mr. Hoffer all there is to ask him today? Okay, and thank you, Mr. Auditor, and thank you, Tanya.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Good luck.
Chief Auditor.
The Chief Auditor?
Tanya's
Chief Auditor.
Chief Auditor.
Good day.
Good day. Thanks again. We are off.